This is Amit here. So I head the product engineering for Kairos. So what we're sort of going to discuss today is the aspect of how do we accelerate and contextualize API testing, especially considering the fact that API testing gives us the maximum coverage, in terms of the amount of unit time you spend building the test versus the ROI that you get, right? So for every unit time spent on doing API testing, so the amount of test coverage that we get is extremely high. So given this scenario, how can we accelerate this part, and what are some of the challenges that people face, and how does Qyrus API Discovery, which is the core topic of our webinar today, helps our clients to actually execute that or use this feature in order to get that, right? So before we sort of get there, so one of the key things is we recently ran a survey, and then Kairos has been there in the market being used by large enterprises to small startups, especially in the area of fintech, banking, retail and logistics, and so on. So we have quite a wide base of audience. Now, so I will not sort of go through into all these aspects and the results of the survey, but 2 or 3 aspects that I would like to sort of draw your attention to is the first thing, which is we feel which are very important and relevant, is 47% of respondents, and which consists of testers and senior testers and QA leads and so on. 47% of them responded that they do not adequately test their APIs. Right, and out of which, when we asked them why and what are some of the key challenges, 78% of them said that because the whole API testing landscape itself is extremely complex to start using. And more importantly, so if you dig deeper into that, what are some of the areas that are actually making them feel that it is complex? Is this aspect about knowledge that is required in order to do API testing, and then how do we, in the procuring or the acquiring of that knowledge? So whether it is things like API documentation or getting the right people or getting the right inputs from developers, and these are some of the things that testing teams actually feel is the fundamental challenge that they face when they look at doing their API testing, right? So, and again, why this is important is we all know this antipattern. So one of the key things, the pyramid on the right is our ideal model, where we say there has to be a lot of unit tests and a few integration tests. When I say few, compared to the unit tests. So the base of the pyramid is the unit test, and there should be a lot of integration tests, and there should be very few UI tests and further less amount of manual tests. But however, what we see is the reverse of it, where a lot of people prefer, not having so many of unit tests, but the pyramid is basically inverted, and it goes into this pattern or an anti-pattern, what we call as ice cream cone, right? So how do we sort of reverse this? Now, this is where we sort of end up with. Right. And again, if you look at and focus on only the middle part of it, which is the automated API tests and integration tests and component integration tests. So that forms the context for API testing. Right. Now, why is this important? And again, I think we have many people, all of us have sort of looked at this in different ways. The first thing is, we all know that the reason we are all attending this webinar and we are running this and we spend so much time on doing this stuff is because APIs form the backbone of all the applications that we typically see, and not just web applications. This includes mobile applications and web applications together. Or in fact, APIs themselves are full-fledged applications that businesses expose, for others to use and connect to. The other thing is we just spoke about, and that's what our survey told as well. And you can sort of correlate this with a recent survey that that the report that Postman also publishes every year, which is called the State of API. That the data says that the amount of API testing that is done is still not up to the mark that it is supposed to be, and the main obstacle is something to do with to do with complexity, and this is especially aggravated when the task of building these functional tests or the API tests are to be done by someone who is good at the functional understanding of the application itself. Right? So if there are individuals or if there are testing teams who have extremely good functional knowledge of the domain or of the application or of the industry, having them do the API tests or testing is always preferred because they bring that perspective. But it's not possible to do that because primarily, the complexity sort of stops them from sort of implementing as much coverage as they would like to, because as a survey mentioned, so acquisition of knowledge, understanding the documentation, understanding the nitty-gritties of how API works, and so on, right? So that's the fundamental context that we're coming from, and the intent, as it clearly comes out, is that in an ideal world, we would like to do API testing by removing all this complexity. Number one, number two, thereby enabling people who have good amount of functional knowledge to be participating in the API testing process, so that they can further amplify the overall coverage that we get from building API tests itself. And Kairos as a platform has already solved this, right? So that's not the topic of our webinar today, because Kairos as an API testing solution is something that is very well known, and it's extremely easy. And a few things, right? For example, here you can see that this is one of the screens, and since we are not going into the nitty-gritties of how to do API testing on Kairos, I just wanted to sort of give you a highlight about what does API testing in Kairos actually consists of. Right, so you can sort of do multiple kinds of testing. You can do functional testing, performance, and API process. There is service virtualization capabilities. You can import APIs into Kairos into multiple ways. There is Postman collections that you could import. You could upload Swagger documents and open API specs, right? And then you could build test suites out of it, which will help you do a bit of housekeeping and test management as well, right? So this is the fundamental Kairos API testing. And then what you could also do is, take those APIs and convert them into what we call as the API processes, where you can sort of stitch together these different APIs and then execute them in a way that they are called in your real life or in your production, for example, right? So there is that option that is available. So where you can sort of build the plumbing between these, and you could run end-to-end tests, which otherwise take up a lot of time. Right? So you could do that. And then, the same test that you wrote before in the functional tab is something that you can get here and stitch them together using this drag and drop interface. And when they run, so they give you this report like this, where it is like a complete flow, where you can see how the entire flow worked. And you can also figure out what APIs where if there is a failure that occurs, then you can precisely know why that failure occurred and what are the areas which service was responsible for it, and can sort of get that holistic reporting where the assertions that we write for each of those APIs are also carried forward, right? And you can also get the non-functional understanding of these results, where you can assess whether the entire process, how much time it took, and you can load these and convert this into performance test as well, right? So that's what the current API capabilities are already doing. So our API testing, to sum up, is completely codeless. It is, you can sort of start by writing that functional test and convert them into end-to-end tests and plumb the data between these services, load these APIs or load these end-to-end processes, and get test results out of them. And you could also do some non-functional testing as part of this, right? So this is something that is already there in Kairos, right? So this solves a lot of problems that we just spoke about in terms of complexity, in terms of involvement from other teams. Now, but the key question remains, like, how can we make it even easier, right? So the whole starting point, right? So while we have this ability to import Postman collections, while we have this ability to import, open API specs, and so on, but can we further accelerate that process from there, right? And more importantly, I think the operative word here is what we call as being contextual. Now, what does contextual mean? So if you look back, one of the things that we discussed is whether person who has the functional understanding of the application, or the person who knows the domain or the industry, can he take part in this API testing so that it is more effective? Now, the only way that can happen is we have to build on top of the knowledge that we already have, which is where the contextual knowledge sort of comes into picture, right? So basically, the contextuality of API testing itself needs to be brought in. And the answer for that is Kairos API Discovery, right? So which is the topic of our webinar today. Now, what does this actually mean, right? So what exactly is Skyros API Discovery? So first of all, it's a Chrome extension that is sitting next to, obviously when it is a Chrome extension, it is running on Chrome or Edge or Chromium-based Edge, which basically means that it is sitting next to the application that you're testing from a functional perspective. So let's say you have a web app and you're trying to test the app. So yes, we all know that the web apps behind the scenes, they call these APIs. So we have to fetch these APIs, which are essentially the same APIs that we would otherwise test in a typical scenario, right? So because it sits next to your web functional testing, it is automatically contextualized and it's at the same place. So you're not sort of going out of your workflow where you feel that you're splitting from your workflow and going and doing API testing, but instead it is contextual to the app testing that you're already doing on your web browser. So that's the key thing, very important, right? So it sort of fits into the context. The second thing is we could also generate tests out of these right on the Chrome extension itself, right? And then we could basically take these and shift or move them to Kairos or import them into Kairos to sort of scale this testing to perform non-functional testing as well on those APIs that we extracted while we are doing the functional testing, right? So it's a Chrome extension, which makes it contextualized to your functional testing because you're on the same web browser where you're performing these tests. And then you could auto-generate this. So it will help you rely on our AI model to actually build the tests for you. And then you could quickly import them and start executing them. So that from the time, since you had no API test, to the time you have a full suite of API tests tied to a specific scenario or a functional scenario is very, very less, thereby making this the fastest way to build your API tests, right? So what we will do now is we'll switch to the demo where I'll sort of walk you through this scenario using one of the workflows that we have, right? So let's begin. So let me share my screen quickly. So as you see on the screen, so it all begins by, so let's say this is the site I would like to test. So this is one of our bots. So what we'll do is, so following, now let's say this is my site and I'm here. So before that, I just wanted to sort of show you what sort of Kairos looks like. So this is Kairos. And then under that, I have API testing. So I can sort of go in here. And then there are multiple projects. And if I go into any of the projects, so let's say, so I'd like to go into this project and we can see the same thing, the screenshot that I showed you before. So this is a test suite, and you see that I'm set with these multiple things here. Like, I can import it from, and we support SOAP, REST, and Graph APIs. So I can import it from Swagger. I can upload Swagger JSON, and then I could build it manually as well. And then I could import collections, right? So all the things that we just discussed. So let me zoom in case if people are not able to see it. All right, so let's go in here. And then what we do is quickly go, and let's assume that this is the thing that I'm testing. So I'll sort of use two examples here to demonstrate this capability. So I'll go in here and you have something called as Skyros API Discovery here. Just click on it. And then it sort of brings this up, right? So here you can see there's multiple things. It says session available. It means that it knows that you're already logged into Kairos, right? So that it can do that import better. Now, what I do is I hit this record button. So it says it started the recording session. And I'll go in and, let's say I'm doing this just for the simplicity of understanding. So I'll go here and I do whatever I have to do. See, again, I'm a functional tester. I'm not sure about what APIs are getting called and so on and so forth. I'm just testing my application manually, and all the thing is happening behind the scenes using the extension. So I click on login and you will automatically see that these are the API calls that are made. And there are a couple of things that you need to observe. One is the API calls are made and it is auto-converted into natural language so that I can understand what this API call is. So again, the intent is contextualization. Because if I display like the way, let's say our network tab on Chrome displays, like, there's something /v2/ something, right? Or whatever your developer has given the name or the context path, then it becomes very hard. So what we essentially do as part of this plugin is understand what is the request and response that went in, and then the response that came back. And based on that, we decide what this actual service call actually does, right? So in this case, you can see one is we are authenticating a user. And then second thing is it sort of gets a list of projects. As you can see, there are multiple projects that we sort of pulled out. And then that particular project that we created. Now that is one. So now I know, and if you see, there is a lot of calls that happen behind the scenes, right? So there are things like Google Analytics. You might be doing some RUM monitoring. There might be things related to, something that you use to analyze your performance of your application. So all of those things are not relevant to me. right? So I am a functional tester and I only care about things that affect my functionality. Now, and there might be situations where you're also calling a third-party API, which may not be useful for me right now because I'm focused on the functionality that my application exposes and the functionality that is called or the APIs that are called by my application. So in such cases, to control this, so we have this concept of filters, right? So say, okay, filter everything or pull only or include only these domains, right? So which is something which is Quinox.info, which is our URL, right? So which is our endpoint and only pick from there. So I could exclude certain domains. I could add certain domains, things like I could exclude Hotjar. I'm not interested in, let's say, some imagery that gets downloaded from your CDN and things like that. So I have complete control on what I should include and what I should not. So in case if you think your functionality has some dependency on external an external site which is not running on the same demo, same endpoint or same domain, you could always add that to this and run it, right? So now I have this. Now what I can quickly do is two things. One, I could go ahead and generate these tests, right out of here, but I can go and understand this in a much simpler way, right? So let's say what is happening here. So this is the URL that is called to authenticate. Here are all the headers that are getting passed. And again, these are immaterial in most cases. And then this is the payload that is going as part of the request. And here is how the response is coming back, right? So here's the response that here are all the projects that this particular user has created. Now, what I can quickly do is I could go generate the test. But before we generate the test, another thing that we spoke about before, right? So Kairos has this ability to sort of figure out the dependencies between these APIs as well. So that functionality sort of is extended here as well. So I could quickly go to this graphs here, and then I could basically understand the dependency. So right now, these are just two calls. So the dependency is not coming up, but a larger call will have multiple calls where let's say there is a token being shared and things like that. So those get extracted and we get a dependency graph between these APIs that get called, right? Right now, there are three. Now, let's assume like this is the API, right? So this is at the heart of it, it's a login API, as simple as that. Now, what I can quickly do is hit this button. Now, what it does is it starts generating the assertions, right? So if I go back to Kairos, so assertions are again completely codeless, but you can refer to our documentation or look at our videos on YouTube. So you'll find out how we do assertions, but you can see quickly before we hit the generate button. So we had just, these four things, which is URL, headers, payload, and response. But now we have assertions which are built in, right? So I can go in here and I can see there are some assertions built in. So I could do the schema assertion, and then I could go ahead and do the JSON assertion as well, right? So which is the response that I got, right? And I could do the same thing for this, right? So this is the total list of projects that come back. Now imagine it can be any of it, right? So you can apply it to your own APIs that you have, and you can suddenly start seeing that it can be a list of if you're from finance domain, then let's say there is an account summary that is coming back, and you see there are multiple accounts, and each accounts have to have certain balance. So it can be anything that comes back. But in this case, it's the response is much bigger. So in this case, I'm getting a list of projects, like all these projects. So you can see this is all my response, right? Like we spoke about. But now there is something called as a JSON path assertion as well, right? So there I'm getting these different projects and then associated JSON path, which is exactly like a key value pair assertion. Now I could get schema assertion as well, and I can get some header assertions as well, right? So this is something that I can quickly do. I mean, if you sort of think about it from other contexts, right? Let's say you're using something like SOAP UI or Postman and things like that, you're essentially writing a lot of code. Let's take Postman for example. If you would like to do a simple header assertion, you would at least write 2 to 3 lines of JavaScript code in order to sort of do this, right? But here it's quite quick. Now, what I can do with this is I can quickly hit export. Now, since I mentioned before that it already knows that I'm logged into Kairos, so I can quickly select my team, right, on which team I'm on Kairos. So it's going to fetch those projects. And in that, we have this project called web that we just created. So I'm referring to this particular part. So which is web project. Under that, I have this suite called test, right? So I can go back. I can go back here. And in that, there are 2 test suites. One is basic one and test. So I can say select test. And then, so it basically builds these, gets these scenarios, and then all the tests as required by Kairos. And then I could basically, the export is complete. So now I go back to Kairos.
and then see there is nothing here. So I just do a refresh of this page, and you can see that we will have all the tests that we created just now. So they have sort of popped up here, right? So these are the 2 tests that we built scenarios for. So now when I go into this scenario, and you can see all the data that is required to make a call have all been there. So there are headers here, or sometimes I would also be required to say, not use certain things, right? So for example, content length, I may not want, or cookies is something that I don't use, for example, right? So you have complete control on what you want and what you don't want as part of your API call. And then basically I could go ahead and if you look at our assertions as well, so you can see all the assertions have been keyed in as well. So you don't have to come and select this. So it has automatically understood, pass the request, pass the response, and now you have this ready. So now what I can do is quickly save this particular test and then go ahead and execute it. So we have this capability to run it across multiple environments and so on. So I will not sort of talk about that, right? So, and you can see the test has already started running, and this is how our reports look like. So although it is running on cloud, but it sort of runs, as quickly as as it would run on a local scenario. And this is all like sort of a shared infrastructure. So there are multiple teams, and they're all running on the same on the same environment. And sometimes it's all queued as well, right? So if there are hundreds of tests that are running, so you have first come, first serve, and there are multiple. Okay, and then here we had a failure. So let's see what was the reason. Okay, so here, and you can see that there was a date assertion that we had put in, right? So, and then the response had this this aspect here, which is we were expecting that the time was 16, 28, 30, but it was 36. So hence it failed because there was a mismatch. But rest of it, okay, whether it was created by so-and-so, whether it is equal to this, the answer is yes. Okay, is my schema validation passed? The answer is yes, right? So that's how it quickly works. Now, as I said, you have complete control over this, right? So let's say, okay, you don't want this failure to occur, but let's assume that you don't want this assertion because the times keep changing, because every time you run, it's going to make a new call. So you don't want this to be a hard assertion. So what I can quickly do is go back to this test that we had. So let's go back to that particular project and go back to that test. So this was a get list of all projects. So I'll go in here, I'll go to assertions, and I'll go to assertions of the header. And there was this, right? So this was the assertion that we had. So what I can do is essentially remove this. Let's assume that, okay, it's going to keep failing my assertion. So I can sort of do that and then save it. And then go back and execute this test. Let's assume that let's remove this content length as well, right? So I could save this, and then and I could go ahead and run this test as well. So you have complete control. But if you see the time it took from having that API, not knowing what these APIs are that are getting called behind this functionality, and then from there going to this particular test, building this, generating the assertions, importing into Kairos, and executing and getting a result. Right? It's extremely fast. It took less than 5 minutes for us to do it completely. Now, what I would also like to sort of highlight is another use case. Let's say something like this, and let's go and open up a recorder here. And this is just to highlight the contextualization part of it. Is, let's say something like, so I don't want to record it. So let's go in a specific functionality. So now let's assume that you are somebody who knows and who has tested this application a lot, so you know how it works, but you're now curious. You also want to do some API testing. So let's assume that you are a user who is responsible for testing. So this is a standard human resource management application, open source. And then let's assume this is something that people use to sort of apply for leaves, and so manager comes in and approves the leaves and so on, right? So from that perspective, so let's say how you do your automation today, right? So if you look at it from a functional perspective, I can obviously do it from UI. So I can log in, I can go to this leave module here, and then, okay, I can see this is the leave, and then I can sort of go ahead and approve it, right? So I can do this manually. But imagine some complexities are coming. So right now, there's only one application. Like imagine if you have hundreds of it, and you would like to go and approve it for a specific user. Now, how do you do that? So you'll have to loop through this list of leaves and then go and approve it. So sort of I'm making a case for API testing. So why API testing is very fast is
you don't have to do all that when it comes to API testing, because you don't have to loop through it. And the average time it takes to sort of build and run this test is extremely high. But here you need not, right? So let's assume that I am this and I have this API Discovery plugin with me. And then what I can quickly do is I'll go ahead and record this. And then I say, okay, now I'm curious because I don't know what is that leave. Is there a leave API? Is there an approval API that I can use? Oh, yes, there is. Or there may not be, because if you go back to one of the things that we understood is a lot of testing teams, as part of our survey, was that a lot of testing teams do not essentially know what services are called on what functionality. That's a knowledge that exists, and it's hard to procure, especially in a distributed environment sort of system, right? So now what I can do is, since I've hit this record, so I can hit approve, and you can see that, okay, these are the requests that are getting created. So there is, if I have to test the approval of leave, I have to do testing of these two APIs, right? So that's what it means. So one is a put request, and then once that happens, it basically gets another, to just see the list. So now you see there was one leave before, and now it is 0. So after I do this, now again, extremely easy. I can click on this. This is the API that I need in order to test my leave approval functionality without actually going through, the standard way that we do today in automation. So the reason I'm bringing this is also from an automation perspective, is that if things get harder, and these kind of things are harder, because especially when you sort of have to loop through many things and you don't know how many records exist and so on. So that time, an API test like this is extremely helpful. Now, what I can again do is quickly export this. So go back to that same thing, come back here, it fetched all the projects for me. So I'll select my project. This is a web project. And then here is my suite called test. And it's sort of going ahead. And so it's going to go and upload this test, right? And then I can sort of come back here. So we were, so this is my project. And you can see there are 2 more APIs that are generated. So I can sort of go in here. And you can see I could make some corrections if there are errors, because we are writing and generating these assertions on the go. And you can basically go ahead and test all this stuff, right? So it's very, very quick and very fast, right? So finally, what does this essentially mean? How does it help to sort of summarize? Let us go back to our presentation here. All right. Yeah. So what we are saying in conclusion is that, number one, this is the fastest way to get started with automated API testing, because even if you have no idea, you have no access to documentation, you are doing your functional testing. It's sits next to your browser, so you can just simply turn it on, fetch these APIs, and go ahead and execute. That's number one. Number two, these are very comprehensive tests. So we are talking about partial contract testing because we are doing schema validation as well. So apart from your standard tests like on headers and on JSON path and body and so on. And then this also reduces the manual effort and obviously potential errors, because you're not like sort of, the life cycle itself is extremely complex. See, all you're doing is just turning it on and saying export this to Kairos, and then you go ahead and run there. So there is very little manual effort where you're not keying in details. So it's much easier. The second thing is extremely high coverage. Not because, one is obviously because API testing is like that. It does give you very high coverage, but this is coming at the minimal setup. So you're not really writing a framework. You're not writing any orchestration or anything like that. You're essentially you're just doing your regular workflow of doing some functional testing of your web application, and then you are getting the outcome. You're getting the API test or the test suites, right, as an outcome. And then finally, it seamlessly integrates with Kairos. So you can take this and go back and put it into Kairos, stitch them together, export the process, performance test it, and report it centrally. So all the benefits that you get as part of Kairos are also available for you right at that point. Now, we are also extending this capability to mobile applications as well in some time. So that will also help you understand what calls are being made from an API perspective from a mobile app as well behind the scenes, so that you could also build tests or contextualize your API testing with your mobile functional test as well, as we just did it with web applications, right? So that's a sort of a quick summary. This is something that is live and it's already integrated with this environments. If you're an existing Kairos customer, you can use it. If not, please sign up for a free trial, and then we can sort of go from there. So you can also use the chat window if you'd like to ask any questions, or you can reach out to us at support@kairos.com.